more recently, as the opportunities have emerged for First Nations people to participate in, benefit from clean energy, we've also been working at the coalface of understanding what are the barriers to First Nations participation and benefit from renewable energy. So we work in innovation in that sector. To do that, one of our programs is the Clean Energy Communities program. When we first started looking at the obvious solutions to economic empowerment and energy independence in remote and First Nations communities, we naturally looked to solar and renewable energy solutions as being the clearest pathway forward. We knew that a lot of this activity in clean energy development would be happening and requiring First Nations consent through native title and other agreements. But we also knew that there were many structural barriers, including policy, technical and commercial, that were currently precluding First Nations people just from accessing fair and affordable energy and consumer protections that other energy consumers take for granted, let alone being able to benefit from things like consumer energy resources, microgrids and the whole host of other innovations that we're starting to see and talk about today. So part of the work that we do is building in practice projects like some of the microgrid projects that we're talking about, innovating to change law and policy through on-ground experience in developing these and understanding what those barriers are in practice, to not just have projects that are developed and hold real-world benefit for those communities, but they contain the lessons that we need to reform the regulatory and the policy and the legal frameworks so we can actually scale these solutions and move forward with First Nations communities playing a leadership role in the transition.
We launched First Nations Clean Energy Network in 2022, bringing together First Nations communities and organisations to collaboratively work with industry and investors like you guys, and legal technical experts to ensure First Nations people have a critical transition to clean energy and reliable power.
This is a little bit of the journey that took us to the Right to Power work. So with some of our demonstration projects on the ground, they really had to look at what those barriers were that were preventing First Nations from accessing renewable energy through things like rooftop solar at the outset. Way back in 2019, when we first started tackling this, and I have to say most people in our team are not energy sector experts at all. We're community development people, we're change makers, we're advocates, we're community representatives. And so this has been quite a big learning journey for us, understanding all of the levers of change in this sector, all of the technical parameters, all of the regulatory parameters that are needed to work cohesively together to actually get these projects off the ground. The first project we worked on was looking in the Northern Territory where I'm based. We had never had the successful integration of a prepayment meter with consumer energy resources like rooftop solar prior to 2021. We decided to tackle that first. We've got 10,000 First Nations households on prepayment meters in the Northern Territory alone and 15,000 across the country. Unless we started there and started to understand what the barriers were, we'd never get anywhere in terms of inclusion. So we started working there with a single trial home. Norman Japarula Frank and his family put their hand up to be the first home where we installed rooftop solar. Social housing in Tennant Creek, one of the hottest places in the country, prolonged heat waves. Household social housing is largely under 5 NAITHERS star rating. People are living in dangerous hotboxes with no solutions to bring down their energy costs. And they have a prepayment meter that is the default supply arrangement in their community. Up until then, the retailer had said it's not possible to integrate rooftop solar with a prepayment meter, so you're fundamentally excluded from the transition. We decided to test that theory and we simply put the solar on the roof, connected it through a prepaid meter, saw that it worked. There was a little bit of behind the scenes research and development around this and testing with the meter manufacturer, but ultimately the technology worked. And with a lot of work around advocating in the media, telling the story about the need to include social housing and First Nations housing and prepayment customers in the transition, we were able to convince the retailer to apply the feed-in tariff. That particular house with 6.6 kilowatts of rooftop solar went from an average of 24 disconnections in a year to 0, with often a buffer supplied by the feed-in tariff that means he's never disconnected since. That was a real-world success story, but it didn't automatically translate into regulatory change. These changes have never been codified. We're still having some of the same arguments. And Norman Frank has said, I may be the first social housing resident in the Northern Territory to receive this. I don't want to be the last. Yeah. This is a battle that continues. So in 2021 to 2025, we've been working on scaling up that solution. How do we use prepayment meters combined with community solar to share the benefits and to make sure that those 10,000 customers aren't excluded from the solutions? I'm really pleased to say that also with the support of an ECA evaluation grant, we've just completed the first 12-month evaluation of the first Aboriginal community-owned and grid-connected solar microgrid in Australia, which tells us that having access to benefit-sharing arrangements like solar credits being applied to prepayment meters from the community's own asset, that community has gone from being in fairly extreme energy poverty to now actually being an energy generator, being energy independent, and actually saving the government money on avoided diesel generation costs. So those are the kinds of success stories that we've been involved in, but they are hard slog. They involve a lot of relationship building with the change makers, with the regulators, a lot of work with communities to build capacity to understand how we actually take control of that energy transition and how we move from excluded customers to leaders in the sector. At the moment, we're working on, and we hope to launch in May this year, the first Aboriginal community-owned and utility-scale 2.2 megawatt solar farm in the community of Borroloola, supplying over 70% renewable energy to that town. In addition to saving the government emissions and avoided diesel through that, the income generated from a power purchase agreement will actually be realised on prepayment meters by Aboriginal residents in Borroloola as credit on their meters on a weekly basis. That's how we're tackling that level of exclusion. So I just wanted to say that those are some of the innovations and the project development work that's happening and why it's so important to understand what we do with prepayment. Tinkering around the edges isn't going to get us to energy equity or energy inclusion in the same way that building these types of solutions does.
You touched on that there, Lauren, about the disconnections. We've got some numbers here from the different states that we get in and around, but a lot of our community mob there get disconnected, and there's food spoilage and health conditions. Our community people are the worst off people in Australia with health conditions, and we're one of the highest rates of health conditions where we go hospital and we end up in health regions. Helping with that, with the health and stuff, would be helping with prepaid metering and stuff would help our community people, which with their health issues.
So we decided to shine a national spotlight on what has previously been a really hidden cohort of customers in the Australian energy market landscape and policy debate. So this piece of work, I guess we've talked earlier about some of the challenges of this, is it's not an easy solution. There's probably many people in the room saying, why don't we just abolish prepayment metering, because it's clearly discriminatory and it's clearly not a successful budgeting tool. Yes, we'd probably agree with you there. The problem is, though, affordability is the crisis here, and what we know from First Nations communities in most parts of Australia, whether you're on post-pay or prepay arrangements, people are still really struggling, and it's either you're struggling with debt, huge debt accrual for one person, with a bill in their name, or you're struggling with regular disconnection. So people are between a rock and a hard place, and prepayment metering is clearly not the solution that is going to help mob around energy security, but it was a key challenge that we had to balance when we had communities saying, we don't think switching simply to prepay is going to be the solution here. We need wraparound supports, consumer protections, we need fair access to the types of financial hardship and concessional support that other energy customers have as a base starting point, and we need to see real investment in those longer term solutions like community-owned renewable energy.
Well, post-paid metering, post-paid accounts and stuff are detrimental to some communities. Like we visited Cooper recently, and there's bills there of tens of thousands of dollars. So it's just one extreme to the other.
Yeah. So really quickly, because we're not going to get a chance to focus actually on the research that we did, and I encourage you, if you haven't already, please read the report. We've got some links at the end. But what we did find, 500,000 disconnections a year, or in the last 12 months of that research study, affecting nearly 10,000 households across South Australia, Northern Territory, parts of North West Australia, and the isolated networks in Queensland. This is a really widespread part of the energy sector and not one that we often see on the national stage being talked about. What that equated to was an average of 49 disconnections per household per year. So it's nearly once a week that people are disconnecting. When you imagine your circumstances, and particularly when this is happening in the heat waves that we just had across Australia, this becomes a life-threatening scenario. So One of the key pieces we were able to pull out of this data was that there's a very clear temperature threshold that is driving disconnections. We saw that in the equatorial zone at 36 degrees and at 40 degrees across most other parts of prepayment regions. Our conversation with the federal government and their climate adaptation teams has been, this is an area we absolutely need to invest in to make sure no one is disconnecting during a heat wave. We'll talk a little bit about how that went.
I was going to say, we just recently experienced 10 to 12 days of over 40 degrees up north, and then I think some of our regions got to over 50 degrees Celsius. So pretty hot, and doesn't cool off, and doesn't allow anything to cool off the land and stuff like that. So we all suffer, flora, fauna, and poor community members.
And you can see some of the other impacts there, from loss of food and medicine, other critical infrastructure, communications and emergency services to households. It's a huge area that there are a lot of externalised costs for not dealing with energy security for prepayment customers. But I think today we're invited here to talk a little bit about how you make change from this sort of information. Many of you may interface with this daily and understand those challenges. What we wanted to do was really make sure that this didn't become a piece of research. We went into communities, we asked people what they thought about prepayment, we asked for the data from retailers, and then we popped that on a shelf and said, job done. We absolutely didn't want to do that, and so we are still working on this, and we will continue until we get the change that we've advocated for. We'll talk a little bit about how we did this, but the way that Original Power and the First Nations Clean Energy works, and our research partners from communities that were prepayment customers themselves or from prepayment communities, we worked at a co-design for the process at the outset to understand how we build in dealing with those challenges where there is no easy and obvious solution from this. We put together a unique team. We had not just researchers, not just community representatives, we had policy experts, we had data analysts, and we had change makers, which was really important because we want to make the change that the communities are actually advocating for. We brought stakeholders together around a shared goal. I think this is really important. A lot of retailers and government bureaucrats who've worked on this for a long time throw their hands up and say, how do we deal with energy poverty? How do we deal with customer behaviour challenges for prepayment metering? Is it more community education that's needed? We don't think that's the answer. We think the clear drivers of these disconnections that are being revealed through this is the affordability crisis. We all know that's across the board, but when you are on a very precarious energy supply arrangement like prepayment, it becomes even more critical to address that affordability. So we brought stakeholders together to say, is this our common goal? Can we and do we actually commit to keeping prepayment customers connected? And that's how we were able to bring retailers and other policymakers around the table on a goal that they shared with those communities. And then we asked how. What's the gap analysis? What aren't you doing here that another jurisdiction is doing better? What can we learn internationally, nationally? These are all really important things. We're able to bring that together into a set of really practical recommendations for change. Some that are short term, some that are longer term, like there's access to consumer energy resources and overcoming those barriers. The key piece though that we've really focused on was the heatwave protections as an immediate goal. We said this is absolutely possible. The smart meters have the function to do not disconnect during certain conditions. Let's apply that where we can see the data is telling us we need to. So, just really quickly to wrap up, we launched this report in November 2025. We were down in federal parliament with a whole bunch of the research team there. We had a response from the federal government with the appointment of their special envoy for climate adaptation, Kate Thwaites, taking charge of the federal government's response to this. We've since seen a budget allocation for a trial of heatwave protections, with retailers being asked to opt into a trial this coming October, this summer, to apply to thousands of prepayment customers to say, let's actually trial this function where those customers won't disconnect. We'll collate the data, we'll see what impact this had, and we're really pleased to say as of 2 days ago, meetings in Canberra have gone really well, and we're about to see that trial start to roll out later this year. So really encourage any retailers in the room to make sure that you're taking the steps necessary to opt into that trial, and we can actually see that protection happening.
And no, I was going to say thanks a lot for that, because we, over time, first of all, but we'd like to also thank our partners and those guys that get behind us and back us wholly and solely. So,
Absolutely. I think everyone knows who they are. Big thanks to ECA, because without them, this research and this work and this ongoing advocacy would not be possible, but also to all of the social service sector organisations in the room, Justice Equity Centre, all of our research partners on the ground. This has been huge. You can find the report there, and please come and have a chat to us if you think there's any way you can contribute to prepayment inclusion. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, guys.